Bones, Native Spirits, a work of fiction by Jenny Munch, published by Warrior Publications, 810-630-0577, located in Grand Blanc, Michigan, Post Office Box 127. Copyright 2003 by Jenny Munch. All rights reserved, including the right of reproduction in whole or in part in any form. Preface. Heat from Mother Earth rose in the early morning, warming the dew and steaming Father Wind's breath so that it covered the endless forest with mist. There, slowly, a man awoke. The songs of birds were loud in his ears. The tickle of tiny insects crawling over his naked body felt strangely pleasant to him. Light crept into his head by way of tiny slits he made between his eyelids. The young light glowed a soft green through the thick bunches of tall grass around him. But he refused to open his eyes wide for fear that the reflection of them and the full strength of his own animal fierceness would frighten away any nearby game. He continued to lay silently in the grass, not moving, inhaling without sound, sifting out the faint odor of the animal dung that he had smeared over himself the day before, and searching out the musky smell of elk or something better. He concentrated on the sounds of the early morning, the songbirds, then the sound of a hawk. Was it circling overhead? He listened to the cry of the bird of prey, trying to distinguish if the bird was passing over or circling. Maybe it could see the carcass of a dead animal nearby. Maybe it saw him. But it passed. He continued to listen and breathe in the odors around him without moving or opening his eyes. This was his secret. He was the best hunter among his people, but he did his killing alone. He didn't care for the company of his brothers. He lived for the hunt and had such a reputation that others were afraid of him. Some even feared that he wasn't really a man, but an evil spirit that roamed the woods. His body went rigid at the sound of a snapping twig. With expert precision, his ears located the direction of the noise. He held his breath, waiting for another sound, grasping a weapon that lay to his right. Then, at the telling sound of a sniff, he jumped to his feet. Eyes wide open, he flung short spear with his strong hand and gangling arms. It stuck into the neck of a young buck that was his target. The startled animal jumped, turned, and ran at full speed to the forest where it had entered, away from the snarling beast that pursued it. Too frightened to consider the stick that hung from its neck, the deer bounded away, trying to lose the fierce predator that chased it. The two animals ran blindly, barreling through the bush, jumping over falling trees. Most obstacles they cleared, but some caused the man to stumble, but he was always put the pain aside and continued the pursuit, never falling. He was losing ground. The buck was outrunning him. So the man let out a cry of anguish and ran faster, more carelessly, screaming ahead at full speed. He was running with such momentum that he could not stop, could not keep himself from falling, crashing through a false floor of vegetation. He tumbled, arms grabbing at empty air. He fell after the buck into the same pit that lay hidden there. Both were never to come back out. 1,000 years later. A young woman walked softly under a canopy of green wild flowers sprang out of a newly sprouted greenery underfoot. She marveled at the color, but most of her attention was directed at the trees. Looking for tangles of vines like the ones that were coiled around the crook of her arm, her brother followed patiently. He was the one who looks after, and he kept a sharp eye out for the ancient hunter that haunted this place. They were far from their camp, but she had noticed the tops of the tall trees and insisted that these were the type of trees where strong vines grew, and she needed them to weave baskets. The sisters' will had won over either of their fears of the evil spirit. She was small-boned with piercing black eyes. She should have been married by now. This stays alone. But she was also shy and preferred the company and comfort of her parents and the protection of her brother. He was tall and sleek, his body firm with youth and the constant toil and rough play of a brave. His gaze was ever sober but gentle. He was the one who took time to help even the old ones. No one taught him this. It was just his nature. "Sister, you have enough. Let's go back. I keep hearing something behind us." Stays Alone laughed. "Oh, brother, you have been listening to—" She stopped in mid-sentence. Her feet froze, and she looked wide-eyed around herself. One Who Looks After stopped also, and looked at his sister in alarm. "What?" he whispered. Something that made a coldness go through my bones. It passed by me. I felt it." She looked ahead at the something and saw it stir a bush in front of them. She jumped backward into her brother's arms. He peered around her. "It's only a rabbit." He tried to say this in a reassuring voice, but Stays Alone could tell that he wasn't convinced either. He turned her with his strong arm and directed the two of them back to the path towards camp, but both of them had their heads twisted, looking behind themselves as they walked quickly ahead. Then, as they watched in horror, whatever was in the bush that moved, it ran quickly around them, circling and stopping so that it blocked their path in front of them. Stays Alone clutched her brother with both arms. He held her tight, trying to cover her body with his own. They froze. One Who Looks After strained to see what this thing was that ran with such speed to circle around them. But there was nothing. He could see nothing in the path in front of them, and yet this thing had stirred the bush and should have been there, now only a few feet away from where they stood. "Sister, tell me, can you see something? Look now and tell me if you see something," he spoke in an urgent whisper. Stays Alone only moved her head to face the path. As soon as her eyes could see the spot where the bushes had last moved, she screamed, "It's the ancient hunter!" She pulled away from her brother and threw the vines that were around her arm on the ground and ran deeper into the forest, away from her vision. One Who Looks After ran behind her. He could hear footsteps crashing in pursuit of them. He caught up to his sister and threw his arm around her, urging her faster down the deer path, deeper into the forest where they had never been before. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder and closer. They could feel the hot breath of the hunter on their necks, then the coldness. Stays Alone screamed again, a loud, long scream that grew more desperate as they fell. The earth gave way under their feet. The two of them tumbled, flailing as they were both submerged in darkness. 500 years later. "Stays Alone?" "Yes, brother, I am here," she whispered back. "Sister, I hear something. It sounds like a great beast. Do you hear it?" "Yes, I do." "Don't be afraid. I wish I could hold you, but this earth that separates us, it will also keep this beast away, so don't be afraid." "I'm not afraid, brother. I know you are near." They were both quiet, listening to the beast outside, afraid that it might hear them if they spoke to each other. But it grew louder, and the earth around them was beginning to tremble. Finally, Stays Alone screamed. "What is it? What is it, sister?" Stays Alone stopped her screaming and gasped. "Brother, I see light!" But One Who Looks After was quiet for a moment, then asked, "But do you see the beast?" Stays Alone answered in a calm voice, "Yes, but it does not hurt me. It is a great yellow monster. It digs at the earth, but it is opening a place where I think I might be able to get out." One Who Looks After was quietly considering what this sister had told him. It had been a long time since either of them had seen light. He had long ago given up the idea that they would ever see it again. "Brother, brother, I am out, I am free, I see the sun." Then, at that moment, One Who Looks After began to see the light also. He could see the yellow beast that had released them. First his right arm was free, and then the monster opened its large mouth and bit out another handful of dirt so that he could pull out his left arm as well. He looked up into the sun, then in front of him. His sister looked at him smiling. Her face was so lovely, how he had longed to see it again. Now he could move his legs. He stepped out of the earth, and the two of them embraced. It was as though they had been reborn. They walked out with their arms around one another into the daylight, into a new world. Bones, Native Spirits, a work of fiction by Jenny Munch. Chapter 1. It's a sinkhole, or at least it was, explained a husky middle-aged construction foreman. He buried his left fist into the flesh just above his belt, where his waist used to be. Yeah, it looked like it was a big pit that slowly filled up with soil and washed down into it over the years. I've seen this kind of thing before. You get to be a kind of geologist in my line of work. He chuckled, a bit impressed with himself. John Meredith and his wife Renee stood a few feet away listening to the man they had hired to build their new home. John smiled politely and listened while Renee was looking around herself nervously, preoccupied by the bits of white stone around the area that had just been dug out for their basement. Finally, unable to suppress her curiosity, she bent down and picked up one of the bits of stone and brushed the dirt away from its surface. The construction foreman, Mr. Cole, noticed. Animal bones. That sinkhole was just full of them. I guess they probably fell through the hole on top and couldn't get back out, or maybe died from the fall. That would have been a hell of a drop. Mr. Cole whistled for effect. Renee uneasily studied the bone in her hand. It was rounded with a type of thick stem on one side that was broken off. If it was an animal bone, then the animal must have been very large. How do you know they're animal bones? She asked. Mr. Cole rested his other fist into the right side, looking defensive. Well, I know I saw a rack. Looked like it came from a big buck or something. He hunched his shoulders, and some of the other bones were way too small to be anything but animal bones. Besides, they were all old. Have you guys got so much property here in the middle of nowhere? They ain't never been no people around here, except a farmer. Indians, Renee offered. Mr. Cole let out a loud breath. I don't know about any Indians around here. Then he looked at John. But if there was, they'd make us stop construction right now. You know that, don't you? John was taken aback. He wasn't sure what to say. He looked at his wife, who was bending over, collecting more bones. He rubbed his jaw. Well, actually, you've already got the basement dug, don't you? Yes, sir, nodded Mr. Cole in the affirmative. Well, then I guess it doesn't really matter at this point, then, does it? Mr. Cole looked back over at Renee, who was ignoring both men and the conversation in her search for more bones. They're just animal bones anyway. He gave John another reassuring nod. So, Mr. Cole anxiously changed the subject and walked to the far corner of the excavation site. See here, this is how far your walk out will be. He extended both arms to symbolize the far wall of the basement. We'll put your door walls in here. He then turned his back to John and stretched his arms out towards the forest. This will be your view from the basement walkout and your dining room on the first floor. He whistled again. I sure do envy you. This is going to be a really nice place. Here in all this wilderness. He placed his hands to his hips. Yep, a real nice place. John walked nearer to the construction foreman to admire the view as well, and then looked around for his wife. He frowned when he noticed that she was still preoccupied with the bones and seemingly unimpressed by the view of the whole idea of living in a beautiful new home. He looked back at the foreman. So everything is on schedule so far? Yeah. I had to do a little manual labor myself to keep it that way, but we're right on time. He chuckled again. These young guys I got working for me are pretty good at what they do, but they just can't handle the number of hours in the sun like I can. He shook his head and chuckled. You should have seen 'em. They were about 3/4 through that big hill where the sinkhole is, and first Bill was operating the backhoe over there. Then all of a sudden he shuts the thing off and jumps down. He says he felt strange. He says first he felt hot, then cold, and then he says it was something that was making him tremble all over. So I tell him he's got a touch of sunstroke and to go sit under a tree and drink some water. So then I get his brother Jake to take his place. Well, Jake only took about a scoop of dirt out of the hole when he jumps off and complains he feels sick too. So I just told the two of them to go home, since they rode together anyway, and come back tomorrow. Then I get on the backhoe and finish the job myself. He laughed and shook his head. These damn kids just don't have the stamina that we had when I was their age. John was listening silently as his fingers curled up to his chin. He didn't care for people like Mr. Cole, but the construction foreman came with good references, and getting his house built was an important thing. He had made up his mind that he should just nod in agreement as long as the work was on schedule. He turned to look back at his wife again. Now she had gathered an armful of artifacts and was making her way towards the wall of dirt that would someday be the rear of their new home. She was walking with one arm extended and the other hugging the bits of bone that she had gathered. She seemed to be oblivious to the two men. Mr. Cole called out to her, "Here, Mrs. Meredith!" She ignored him. He walked over to the pile of rubbish and pulled out an empty cardboard box. "Mrs. Meredith, here's a box to put your bones in." He waved the box and walked over to her, but she still ignored him. She seemed to be in another world, in deep contemplation, examining the walls of the exposed earth with her hand. Finally he made his way up to her side and put his hand on her shoulder. She jumped and turned to face the man with a surprised look on her face. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, Mrs. Meredith, but Anderson, Renee Anderson, that's my name." "Oh, sorry, I thought you two were married," Mr. Cole said apologetically. "We are. We decided to get married, but against adoption." Mr. Cole just stared at her in a confused way, but decided not to ask any questions. "I got you a box here. You can put those bones in it, see?" He smiled good-naturedly at her, but was secretly a bit miffed at her coolness towards him. She looked down at the box and said thank you. She deposited her collection into it and then set out on the ground beside her. Then she turned her back to the man and continued her examination of the excavation site. Something was drawing her to a spot where the bone was sticking out of what was to be the wall of the basement. As she neared it, it appeared to be a rib bone. She inched her way closer to it, but for some reason it was becoming more difficult for her. It was like the air between her and it was getting thick. She was having difficulty pushing her feet forward. Finally, she was close enough so that she thought she might be able to reach it if she stretched out a little. She pushed her hand up through the heavy air and strained until finally the tips of her fingers touched the bone surface. There was an instant shock. She jerked back. "Here, let me get that for you." Mr. Cole was still standing near her. He stepped up and reached up for the bone and then quickly let go and made a "huh" noise. He looked up over Renee with a surprised look on his face, and then he reached up again and forcefully pried the bone away from another until he was able to free it from the soil. He pushed the bone towards her, but she shook her head and pointed towards the cardboard box. Mr. Cole dropped it in with the others. "You know, it felt almost like an electric shock when I first grabbed that thing." He shrugged and looked at Renee, who refused to comment. The young couple continued to scour the area for bones after Mr. Cole had given up trying to be charming and went back to work. Renee sat down on the ground when John handed her something that looked too much like a partial skull. For some reason she felt something like affection for the piece. She carefully removed as much of the dirt as she could with her hand, then gently she stroked what resembled the top right portion of a skull, where the eye socket was easy to make out. "John, this is a person's skull," she whispered with urgency. John looked around uneasily. It did look like a human skull. "Renee, look, the basement is dug. There's nothing we can do now. What good would it do to stop construction? We can bury them again."
John offered his hand on Renee's arm to help her up. She stood up weakly. There was a feeling of hopelessness in her, sorrow, almost like she knew the people who had died there. She reached down to pick up the box that was now full. John helped her by grabbing hold of one side. They were carrying it to their car when Mr. Cole walked up beside them and took Renee's side of the box for her. He helped John load it into the trunk, and then as the couple was getting into the car, he called back to John one last time. "They'll stop this construction cold, tie everything up for years," he warned one last time with a stern look.